So we're calling, today's a special meeting. We have our community meeting actually in August is the next one. So this is a special meeting, and many of you, I'm sure, remember last month, we talked about, Dr. Linda Rudolph talked about the U.S. call to action on climate, health, and equity, and what it is and how it came to be. And today, our focus is how do we apply that? And how do we bring that into real-time advocacy opportunities in California to protect everyone and everything we love. So that's the theme today, and we'd love it if you could put in the chat if you want to put your name, pronouns if you'd like, and where you live. It's fun to see where everybody's coming in from. So just to revisit, as always, our North Star, our mission. So Climate Health Now is a group of California health professionals and health workers who advocate for climate action through a health and equity lens, health and equity framework. We use community organizing to build the base of climate-engaged health, allied health, and healthcare administrator professionals across California in order to leverage our trusted health voices in support of the climate justice movement in order to protect health and achieve health equity. So that's what we're all about. And today we're gonna kind of, this is the brief welcome. The center of the meeting, though, is really our all-star panel and talking about how to apply the policy framework of the call to action. And then we'll close up and we'll share some upcoming dates with you. So usually during our community meetings, we welcome our new members and kind of ask you where you're calling in from. And given our setup today, we won't do that, but we would love to have, we're glad you're here. And we would love you to join our community meeting. The next one, just to flag this, is Wednesday, August 17th at 12:30. And then we would really love everybody who can to join next Wednesday at 12, not 12:30. So next Wednesday, the 27th at 12, we'll be talking about our strategy and our structure and how CHN is gonna try to contribute to the greater movement and what our plans are. So those are great things that we'd love you to join, new and veteran members. And I'll pass it to Amanda.
All righty, excellent. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining. This was the first time we think we've ever successfully played music on a Zoom meeting, so hopefully you were able to hear some music. And I'm Amanda Milstein, one of the co-founders of Climate Health. I'm a pediatrician practicing in Richmond. And thank you all so much for being here. So as Ashley said, what we're here today to talk about is the U.S. call to action on climate health and equity, and specifically how it applies to what's going on legislatively, regulatory-wise in California. Last month, we were very, very lucky to hear from Dr. Rudolph, who provided us with an overview of the call to action, which at a very high level is a policy action agenda that outlines the ways in which climate action benefits health and how action from health professionals and health workers and the health sector like us can promote climate action. Nearly 200 health organizations and health professional societies across the US have now signed on to the call to action. And I will drop a link for it in the chat just so you all can take a look. And today we're going to paint a much deeper picture and see how it is applied to what's actually going on around us. Awesome. So just a very brief overview of how and why we're talking about this today and how the call to action fits into the framework of Climate Health Now. We talk a lot about, all of these different all of the different aspects of advocacy and the work that we are all doing and aspiring to do using our head, our heart, and our hands. And so the call to action is really the head or the strategy part, really the policy and the decision making behind the actions that we're all working together to take. Excellent. So I am going to introduce our panel of climate health equity advocacy leaders. As you can imagine, they all have quite lengthy bios, so I'm going to try to be brief, but just acknowledge right up front that I am leaving out important details. So we'll start with Naila Pope Harden, who has years of community organizing experience spanning regional, state, and national environmental justice campaigns. She is the South Sacramento-based executive director of Climate Plan. And in that role, she manages state policy campaigns, mobilizes partner organizations, provides analysis on policies, state investments and legislation, and builds strong relationships with state agencies and key decision makers, all in order to further Climate Plan's vision of a healthier, more equitable California. Will Barrett leads the American Lung Association's work on clean air and climate change policy in California. He focuses on vehicle emission standards, smart growth, and clean fuels policies. He represents ALA before the California legislature and federal, state, regional, and local agencies engaged in clean air and climate policy. Will has served as a public health representative on advisory panels convened by CARB, the California Energy Commission, and other public agencies, and serves on the Policy Advisory Committee of Climate Plan. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Linda Rudolph, who is the lead for the Center for Climate Change and Health at the Public Health Institute. She works in many different roles, including currently as an advisor to the Medical Society Consortium on climate change, on climate and health. Of note, Dr. Rudolph was the first chair of the Health in All Policies Task Force, a multi-agency cross-sectoral collaboration to find win-win solutions that simultaneously address health, equity, and sustainability. So with no further ado, we're gonna jump in. And sorry, if you don't mind, we'll ask people to mute. Thank you. So we have some questions that we're going to start off with for all of the panelists, and we'll spend the first section of our time there, and then we would love to open it up to questions from you all. So you can feel free either to put questions in the chat as we go, or also there will be opportunity to raise your hand and ask questions at the end, or when we get to that segment. All righty, so Will, we're gonna open up with a question for you. And that is, can you tell us about the general framework for ALA advocacy in California? And in particular, we'd love to hear about some of your examples of your successes and examples specifically of where health professional advocacy in California has been successful.
There we go. Sure. So thanks everyone for having me, and thanks to the group for inviting me to the panel. It's a really exciting organization that you've started and are building, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. I think one of the key ways that I would answer the question about the Lung Association's advocacy work on clean air, certainly we focus a lot on tobacco policy issues, healthcare issues, but on our clean air work, we're really looking at ways that we can get involved and really organize health voices to tell the story of why key policies are needed, why they need to be stronger, why they need to be implemented and enforced. And really what a lot of it comes down to is how do we get to meeting our clean air standards, our climate standards, and doing that in the most equitable way possible, so that as we're moving into cleaning up vehicle emissions or integrating more smart growth or clean mobility options, that we're doing it in a way that everyone benefits and everyone can take part. So there's a lot of kind of crossover between the regulatory work, say at the California Air Resources Board or the Energy Commission or the legislature, where they're hashing out different bills, or in the legislature also the budget with the governor's office, and really looking at ways that essentially we know what we need to do to meet clean air standards. We know the numbers of tons of pollution, and we know the climate numbers we need to hit. How do we do that in the way that best promotes public health, best promotes health equity, and really drives the transition to zero emission technologies across the board? On the idea of some of the key successes and where health voices and health advocacy has really paid off, I would say in some of these rules that are kind of still being adopted and considered now, zero emission truck standards, zero emission vehicle standards are two of the big rules that the California Air Resources Board is looking at. So how quickly we can transition to zero emission technologies to eliminate tailpipe emissions, that's been a major organizing point for Health Voices. Dozens and dozens of health organizations have endorsed letters, have spoken at hearings. And this is not just this year, but going back, over a decade or more, as these policies have been implemented and updated and amended. So there's the transition to zero emission technology, which I think is central to the call to action, but also areas where we can cut diesel exhaust by, forcing cleanup of diesel trucks, forcing cleanup of locomotives. These are some of the areas that are, we're moving forward with now and organizing around, how can we get to the heart of what is essentially cancer reduction policies in our most impacted communities. And I think when we start telling that story as health professionals, health organizations, that these are really cancer reduction policies. It's not about a locomotive. It's about the people breathing toxic air who are, shortening their lifespan because of the locomotives in their community. How can we make that case to get doctors, nurses, health professionals of all stripes talking about the urgency of making these changes for local air pollution benefit and global climate benefit at the same time? I'll stop there.
Awesome. That's really amazing to hear, thinking about it as cancer reduction versus framing it that way is really interesting and makes a lot of sense. Linda, we're wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how the Med Society Consortium uses the call to action in terms of decision making around policies to support, and how how you all apply it as a policy agenda.
So the Medical Society recommends policies at a federal level that we would like to see supported by organizations like Climate Health Now, or the almost 24 other state climate and health action groups. And basically, we've tried to sort of look at what's happening at the federal level that's potentially the most impactful, and then walk through that legislation to identify areas where there's either alignment with the policy action agenda or dissonance with the policy action agenda. So most recently, for example, we did a brief on the Infrastructure, Jobs and Investment and Jobs Act, which is a huge piece of legislation that will direct, over $1 trillion to dozens of federal agencies, but most of which will be passed down to the states. And I think it's a great example of why it's so important to have action at the federal, state, and local level in terms of, what government can do. Because even though the Infrastructure, Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, directs federal agencies and their expenditures, the decisions about how the state money will get spent will be done by agencies like the California Transportation Agency, that Naila will weigh in on, or the Air Resources Board. And so there has to be an interplay between our policy advocacy at the local, state, and federal level. We're looking now at the consortium about what's coming next, and thinking about how we might want to address all of the climate and health relevant provisions in the Farm Bill, because that's another huge spending bill that's coming up for reauthorization next year. So we're really just trying to take advantage of whatever opportunities come along and provide information to people like all of you that will help you in your advocacy efforts.
Awesome. Alrighty, so, and Linda, you teed this up really nicely. Naila, welcome, and thanks for being here. And the first question we have for you is if you can tell us a bit about AB 2438, transportation funding and guidelines. I don't have the specific bill name in front of me. But if you can kind of walk us through the bill and what aspects specifically of the call to action it relates to, and then we'd love to know if you see, what potential and where you think the voices of health workers and health professionals could be helpful with advocacy there.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm going to go all around to answer that question, but I promise I'll get there, because I want to piggyback off of something that Will said. And I think, and just where health professionals' voices are heard, is I think it's really important for all of us to start talking about climate change from every angle and aspect. I think one of the reasons why I don't come from an environmental science background, I don't come from a climate background, I come from an organizing background. And the way that I ended up doing climate advocacy was because everything that I was advocating for my community also benefited the climate. So when we talk about like lowering VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, what we're talking about is making sure that communities have the resources they need within walking distance. When we talk about GHG reduction, we're not just talking about like cleaning the air, but we're talking about making sure people have livable, breathable communities. And so I think like the more that we can stop talking, or I won't say stop talking, the more we can round out the conversation around climate, where it's less about percentage, less about the doom and gloom, and more about like where the potential is, the better. And I honestly believe that healthcare professionals have the ability to make that argument the best, because so many of the issues related to climate change relate to the patients you guys see every day, and the systems you guys interact with. And so 2438 is a piece of legislation. California, you always hear California is the leader in climate change, has setting all these ambitious targets, is doing so much to advance climate change, which if you look at what's on the books and some of the things that we do, that's true. But what you'll find more is we are really good at making plans and targets and less good at actually shifting our current spending in that direction. So new money we get, we spend it the right way, but we have a lot of transportation programs on the books that are heavily polluting, that aren't equitable, that are, hurting communities. And so AB 2438 is a real, like, don't let people complicate it and convolute it. It just says we have climate goals, we have transportation programs, we want to make sure they're in alignment. That's what AB 2438 does, is just make sure that we're following our transportation goals.
Awesome. And actually, as a follow-up, Naila, to that, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm linking things that shouldn't be linked, but can you tell us a little bit about what the SB 150 report is? Does that relate, or how this relates to that? I think that's just kind of interesting for people to hear about.
I think it all relates. So
Okay.
Again, back to like, California is really great at setting ambitious goals. About 15 years ago, there was a piece of legislation called SB 375, which is like this landmark mammoth piece of legislation that says like, we're going to do this intersectional holistic approach to meeting our climate goals. And it has all of these things. And it was just put on a shelf. We did a lot of things to move in that direction. The cap and trade program came out of it. And then about 5 years ago, we said, wouldn't it be nice to just actually do a progress report? And so the SB 150 report is a progress report that comes out every 4 years to see how well we're actually doing to achieve and reduce our emissions. And the report will tell you what I think most of the advocates who are in the climate movement know, is we're not actually reaching the targets that we said we would reach. We've shifted and moved a lot of the way that we've reduced emissions in some areas, but overall, we're not reducing emissions enough. And so there's actually a draft report that's out now that we just submitted comments to that are going to say the same thing that the report 4 years ago said, that we are not doing enough. I actually, when I'm not talking, I'll drop in the dashboard that CARB just released, because you can play around, you can see your region, how well your region is at reaching its targets, lowering GHG and also lowering VMT. But it's all linked because it all links to the fact that without some type of intervention, we're not going to reach our climate targets.
Can I just tag on to that? So for people that don't follow transportation really closely, the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled is the single climate goal that California has that might do the most to improve health in the state of California, because it would shift travel mode toward public transit and active transportation, which if we increased active transportation, we'd increase physical activity and we'd get essentially orders of magnitude greater health benefits from doing that in transportation than only shifting to electric vehicles. So NAILA's, approaching it from sort of the climate and perspective, but where we come in is by making it really clear to policymakers that the bill that Climate Plan sponsored to align our transportation spending with climate goals is actually a health bill.
Awesome.
Is there an, this is Ashley again, is there an advocacy, like is SB 150, that's already passed, so there's not a need to advocate for it, right?
Correct. So SB 150 is the progress report that says our regions are misaligned. There's also the scoping plan that's coming out, which I think Will may be touching on it. And if not, I hate to pass it to you, Will. There's the scoping plan that's coming out that's saying very similar things, that we're just not reaching our targets. Where there is advocacy opportunity is on AB 2438. So sorry for all the numbers and acronyms. That's the piece of legislation that Climate Plan is sponsoring that is saying, let's link our transportation programs to our climate goals.
So another question I'd love to hear from all three of you on this is so thinking about, I mean, there's so much going on, obviously, and it's so many different levels just across the state, from the hyperlocal all the way to the state. I'd love to hear from you all from thinking, so Climate Health Now is working hard to build up our base of health professionals, health workers throughout, who are activated or potentially activated through all over the state. Where do you, each of you think coming at this from thinking about state level advocacy, so things we can be working on for all of California, where do you think there is the most potential or the most need for California health professional voices in the next 1 to 2 years?
Maybe Linda first. I see a smile.
Oh, I was going to suggest that Will or Naila should go first, and I'll tag along afterwards because they're more involved on a day-to-day basis in California policy than I am.
Well, I'm happy to jump in, and I think a couple of key areas that are top of mind right now. Naila mentioned the scoping plan. This is every 5-year planning process that California Air Resources Board goes through to illustrate a pathway to meeting certain climate standards. And so that planning process is going on now. That'll run through, there's actually some workshops coming up. We can put those, I can drop some of that into the chat here. But basically it's an opportunity to provide input about how we get to these climate plans, strategies, goals, targets, how do we get there? And health folks have been engaged to say, we need to get there in the most health effective, health beneficial way possible. Linda brought up the health benefits of active transportation. A lot of us have been pushing on that within the scoping plan process. The health analysis doesn't reflect that. It should have, those kind of elements where we're trying to fill in the gaps on the public health narrative. So the scoping plan, it is a plan. We hope it, is strengthened, doesn't sit on a shelf, actually enacts change. There's another plan out that's coming out this week or next week called the State Implementation Plan. That is the plan for how we achieve our clean air standards. And that is a long list of policies that need to be adopted in the next coming years. Everything from cleaning up locomotives to zero emission appliance standards to reduce NOx emissions or ozone forming gases in California. So there's a long list of policies going in there, including zero emission trucks that need to be addressed. And that strategy is really important. I would argue it's fairly more important than the scoping plan in some ways, because it has teeth to it. It has certain emission reductions per each strategy that have to be hit. If they're not hit, it's actually accountable. You can go and sue for not meeting those targets. So that's two plans, one for climate, one for clean air. There's a lot of overlap in them. The other policies, though, I think that are coming are really getting to this issue of zero emission transportation. The zero emission clean car standard that'll be approved at the end of August. There's a lot of health voices on that. There's a zero emission truck standard that's coming up. There's federal truck standards that can push for zero emission technologies as well. And then I mentioned the locomotive standard. That's actually a zero emission locomotive standard that is coming forward later this year. And so it's this acknowledgement that our transportation sector is the leading source of harmful pollution in California, leading source of climate pollution in California, and everything in that sector has to go to zero emission as quickly as possible. And that includes not just, like Linda said, turning everything into a zero emission vehicle, but also creating zero emission pathways for healthier transportation. So transportation is always where I'm going to start, because it's the largest source of our air pollution burden and the largest source of our climate burdens.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Will and all the plans. I think there are always plans to engage in. And I think one way that your guys' organization could be really helpful is just in the continuing conversation as well, and making those connections that, climate change issues are public health issues as well. And any way that it's possible to make those connections, I think, is important.
So I think your question about, where do we focus is really challenging, because there's so much that's going on that's so important. And you all know you're here because you all see that, we're in a real crisis. So I would say that, what we need to build and what Climate Health Now, I think, could build in California is a cadre of people who are committed to working on policy advocacy, and where you have within a group individuals that build a little bit of expertise in a lot of different areas. So just to give some examples of bills that are in the legislature right now that I think are really important, there's a bill by Luz Rivas, AB 2076, that would establish a syndromic heat surveillance system and give $10 million in funding to the Department of Public Health to establish that, but would also, that funding would allow the Department of Public Health to do a lot more. And just for, comparison's sake, the entire budget of CDC's climate and health program right now is $10 million. So that would be a significant investment. There's AB 2419. That's a real priority for a lot of the environmental justice organizations that would implement a California version of the Justice 40 initiative and make sure that the dollars we do spend on climate change get invested in disadvantaged communities. There's SB 1314 by Monique Limon that would basically say you can't use carbon capture and storage to increase your recovery of oil from oil and gas drilling. That's just, there's many important things. There's stuff happening around appliance efficiency and electrification of buildings, all of which have significant health links. So what I would love to see is having a group of people that want to do policy advocacy, who meet on a regular basis, build connections with people like Will and Nayla and, Tom Phillips that's doing building stuff, or the Building Electrification Coalition, or, the California Environmental Justice Alliance. And there's also, there's not a lot of bills right now, but there's a lot of important stuff happening in the budget around natural and working lands, which relate to food systems and methane emissions. So build connections with people that are really leading the work in these different sectors. And through those connections, identify, what's coming up in this legislative season, or in this budget session, or in these administrative actions, all of which are important, where you think it would be helpful to have a health voice. And then to do the research that's required to essentially provide talking points that a much larger network can use and establish, connections to legislators and to administrative agencies. It's really powerful, as you know, for physicians and health professionals to talk to the people that are making decisions, but they have to be armed with information about what are some of the policy priorities in these different sectors, and how do we make the connection to health so that we can speak powerfully as health professionals. So that's what I would like to see CHN do over the next couple of years.
This seems like a good time to just flag our meeting next week, where we will be talking about the, how we are organizing, which will be around state level advocacy. So it seems like we're heading in the right direction, which feels really good.
Oh, can I piggyback off? Yeah, Linda, we hear you. We're we're aiming to do that. Can I ask a question following up on, and there's probably not a very specific, one exact answer, but in terms of how we advocate, there's so many, there's letters, there's giving public comment, there's email, there's all of these different ways. And I'm wondering if you all have advice or thoughts on, obviously time and logistics are a huge consideration, but how do you think it's most effective? Like, do you think trying to have a health voice join a call that's already being set up, on a specific bill is effective versus sign on, like, would you have a sense of how you would sort of rank order those?
I think it's a great question. As far as ranking, I mean, it kind of takes all threads coming in together. I think we've done at the Lung Association with our health professionals for Clean Air and Climate Action Network, we try to bring in key speakers to meet us where we're having our health conversations. So whether that's speaker from the governor's office this year, we had the chair of the Air Resources Board last year, and we try to do that so that they can give us their perspective and meet the health community at the same time and have a back and forth. And I think that's an effective way. So it doesn't have to be like a public facing thing for them to get to know you a little bit. And we find that very effective. And I think a lot of the folks on this call have joined those in the past, and I think we're planning on a September call again, and we'll do something like that. But letters are really helpful because that is almost the currency in some ways in advocacy, where the more logos, the more you can demonstrate big backing of a policy. So that's always helpful. And I mean, realistically, it's a lower ask in a lot of ways. If you have one organization like Climate Plan right now is doing a great job of organizing dozens and dozens of folks around 2438 and doing a great job of it, bringing a lot of logos into their letters, and that's really important to counter the opponents who are doing the same thing. So there's that kind of meeting, but there's also the need for constantly updating contacts with members if you have capacity to do that, updating contacts with regulators in the different agencies, the staff of the agencies. Again, it takes all kinds of, it's hard to prioritize, but there are different ways I always like to say, especially when we're low on staff, to make yourself look bigger on, than you are. And Climate Plan's a great example of this. It's small but mighty. You would never know it. And they just have such a dynamic team that they appear to be everywhere. And there are a lot of ways to be efficient in this, and that, whether that's op-eds or social media stuff or whatever. I think there are just different ways depending on the different platforms, and I think they're all effective. And as long as the policymaker knows that you're making that effort to educate them on your position, that's the goal.
Yeah, I'll just hop in. Thank you, Will, because it's like all of that. I think it depends on what your theory of change is. I think it depends on what policy you're trying to inform. I'll just say, like, we do a lot of advocacy with the California Transportation Commission. And sometimes that looks like making public comments because we need to make a loud declaration in front of a bunch of people and see how the people in the dais react. We also have a lot of one-on-one meetings with commissioners themselves because not every commissioner likes to be called out, and we want to be able to get information to them that way. We submit letters, we do the comments. Those are good because they're recorded, they're on record, and they require a certain amount of response. But sometimes we just reach out to staff that oversees a program because the staff actually has enough power to make that movement. So it's really hard to answer. And it's like, whatever you have capacity for, whatever you have, whatever your theory of change is, the appetite for, I think none of it necessarily goes to waste. All of it helps. I think, to like Climate Plan's credit, we try and have multiple avenues to deliver the same message. And so finding organizations and multiple pathways to do the same thing. The answer is like, yes, and all of it.
I agree with Naila and Will. And I also just want to emphasize the importance of having, as many people as have the capacity, but at least a few people from Climate Health Now in various parts of the state who want to take the time to get to know some of their local legislators, because building those personal connections with legislator over time, or Will's built real relationships with the Air Board members. Naila's done that with members of the Transportation Commission. That makes a real difference. One, because they learn that they can trust you and that you actually have subject matter expertise that might be important to their constituents. And two, because in my experience, some of these informal conversations with policymakers help identify strategies to influence them that you would never know about if you didn't talk to them. And just as one example, this is from a long time ago, but I was talking with a state legislator who, I just totally randomly said, we were trying to persuade him that he should do something about climate and health. And I totally randomly mentioned something about the impact of heat on insulin. It was like a throwaway comment. And his eyes perked up and he said, my daughter has diabetes. And it shifted the entire conversation. So, letters are very important. Showing up at hearings are very important. But having a group of people who can build some relationships with some key legislators and key policymakers is also really important strategy.
I think just to Linda's last point, I think that, looking at the legislature as one venue, coming into next year, there'll be a lot of new members who would benefit from introductory meetings. Just kind of information, educational. It's not lobbying. It's just, here's our key challenges. Here's some strategies you can take. Happy to meet with you and talk about them.
One other point about building those relationships with electeds. Do you would you triage that, like the most important relationships should be in like conservative Dem districts or purple districts, or should we just, because it seems to me like there's a lot of possible preaching to the choir, and it's hard to know where to target the time in those relationships.
As a nonpartisan organization, I'll just say that I think local voices talking to local representatives is always a helpful thing, regardless of political stripe. Telling the local knowledge, sharing the local knowledge about health impacts, climate change impacts locally. I think that's the best way to go to the extent that you can. And the rest is, relationship building kind of stuff. But, if you have members or, colleagues in a district that is dithering on an issue, having calls from the local physician or pediatrician or whomever can be really helpful.
Alrighty, so let's open it up to questions from you all. And I know some people have been putting things in the chat, but I guess let's try, if you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand and come off mute.
Yeah, we see your hand, Megan. Go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, this may seem like a really off-the-wall question, but it seems to me that until fueling becomes more ubiquitous, people aren't that willing to try an alternative form of transportation. I'm thinking about EVs and hydrogen cars more in this particular scenario. And one of the things I mentioned probably to the Air Resources Board and to the county supervisors was I thought they should stop permitting gas stations and start permitting fueling stations that all offer alternative fuels. They can offer gasoline as well, but they need to offer some alternative fuel so that it becomes more ubiquitous. It's right now, people who have an electric car have to develop special skills to search out where they can get a charge if they're away from home. And it's like an internet search, or if your car, like my car is a Tesla, so it takes me to Tesla stations automatically. But, it just any charging station would be nice sometimes, because like in LA, there's a Tesla charging station in Calabasas, and then there's another one in San Fernando, and there's nothing in between. And you can do a lot of driving in LA if you're doing something down there and need to charge sooner. But I think that if it was more ubiquitous, people would be more likely to want to get an EV, because right now it's like, well, where do I get this thing fueled if I'm not at home? So I think that's why I've been suggesting that to legislators, but it seems to sort of slide right off their ears. It doesn't seem to be something that is catching somehow.
To build up the grid, right?
Yeah,
definitely.
I think that they need to have a grid of places to fuel their cars. And
we could ask if any of the panelists want to comment on that.
Yeah, I was wondering if this is something I should be pursuing.
We do a lot of work around infrastructure for charging, both light duty and heavy duty. And I think and I haven't really thought about it much in terms of placing chargers at gas stations, existing stations or new stations like that. We've certainly focused more on gas stations as far as like a major source of carcinogen, air toxics, and the need to clean them up. But for the overall approach, I think just the continued need for advocacy on, putting as many chargers out as possible in ways that they make sense for, customer engagement, their big signs that say charge here, like the advertising almost. That's really important, but also, just making sure that they're accessible in locations that, are not just freeway charging, spots where you can actually, envision, getting more and more charging stations into communities that may have none now. It's not just sort of like, build them out, but build them out the most equitable way possible. Hit, targets. The Energy Commission tries to hit a 50% target of stations going into disadvantaged communities or low-income communities. We think that's critically important and have been really focused on that quite a bit. But a lot of it comes down to how much funding is available for the state to invest in the charging networks. And I think that's where the budget has been really strong, or the proposals have been really strong lately on that. And then there's also the ballot measure that would put Prop 30 that will be on the November ballot that will invest, billion plus every year into charging infrastructure in the state, along with in additional billions into vouchers for, rebates for consumers and for light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles electrification. And all of that is targeted to the equitable distribution of the funding. So making sure that it's not, wealthy owners buying cars, but it's accessible, accessibilizing, I guess you'd say, the benefits of zero emission technology to every community in California. And the ballot measure also addresses wildfire needs. So again, there's a lot of investment happening. There's a lot more needed. And there's a lot more needed at the federal level too. We know we haven't gotten nearly the full boat that is needed at the federal level based on the bills that have gone through. So I'd say keep arguing for more charging writ large as a way to go. And then the details at the local level of, charging stations with other fuels. I think that's a case by case basis probably.
Yeah, I'll just hop in. Hey, Megan, it's good to see you. I think, so Megan, you're probably just as familiar as as I am. When the same month that the governor released his 2035 all new electric vehicles need to be sold, that executive order in South Sacramento, 2 gas stations just finished being built within like blocks of each other. I mean, I don't walk anywhere and I could walk from one to the other. That's how close they were. So I think the answer is yes, but I think if we're advocating at a local level, exactly what Will's saying, we have to also be careful about the equity implications, because building a bunch of chargers is important and I think will help make that shift. But we also need to make sure that gas is accessible and affordable to folks that need it in the meantime. And we need to make sure that that transition, that we're being thoughtful and intentional about making that transition. And finding a way. I love what you're saying about making like alternatives at gas stations. And I think that's something that there's a lot of potential for, and there's a lot of funding coming down. And I do think that there are advocacy efforts that are needed to make sure that that funding is directed in the most equitable way possible.
Margie, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, let me unmute and on video. Hi, having traveled in Europe and really appreciated and utilized their mass transit systems, why can't we, who can we find who will be interested in expanding and developing and supporting our mass transit system? I mean, as Nala said, we really need to be getting off the roads and using mass transit. So how can we promote that, support that? Anybody doing that?
You might be pushing the envelope there, Margie, which is good.
I think
that's a key. I mean, I think it's a key they talked about an article in the Chronicle this weekend about how the death of downtown, and people don't go downtown and there's no mass transportation downtown. People, it's just there's this dearth of ways to get in that are reasonable and fast. I mean, it's much faster to take mass transit than to sit in traffic. Got to get those cars off the road.
I would just, and I totally hear you. And I just was able to spend some time in a couple of Canadian cities and really appreciated what we saw there as far as land use planning and transportation choices that, you know, spoke to me as far as the, you know, getting people out of cars. But the thing that I think is important is, again, going back to what Naila spoke to at the beginning, is investment of state funding into projects that really help create equitable mobility choices, transit, walking, biking. One of those key areas that so all of us on the panel worked on was the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure at the California State Transportation Agency, that essentially was an implementation step from an executive order Governor Newsom issued in 2019 that basically was like, we're going to tie certain pots of funding in the state's control with meeting our climate standards, and do so in a way that improves public health, reduces vehicle miles traveled, and really boosts equitable choices for how we get around. And so as that process moved forward, it really heavy emphasis on transit, on walking, biking, you know, protecting communities who are heavily impacted by transportation pollution, and really gets back to the 2438 bill that Naila's group has been leading on, and really making sure that we're tying our transportation funding guidelines to those goals and strategies that help improve health, help, you know, basically make it easier and make it more efficient to, you know, pay for or put public funding to projects that improve health. So it's a big ship that's starting to turn, and I think climate plan's right at the front of the ship.
I just want to add that the state budget that was just adopted adds an additional $1 billion for active transportation infrastructure. And that really was the result of very significant advocacy on the part of like California Walks and California Bicycle Coalition. And there's about twice as much as is available in requests to the active transportation program for funding in California, which I think speaks to the fact that with some more proactive health support for active transportation, we could get more next year.
And I think to your question about mass transit, though, what's interesting is, especially in the legislature, or mass transit, folks will get around it by doing two things. They'll say, oh, we're fixing the roads that the buses ride on, and therefore sometimes investments in roads are investments in making sure that our transit system is better. The other thing that people will use is active transportation. Well, people get off the bus and they need to be able to walk to and from home. And so to make the transit system better, what we're also doing is building bike lanes and what we call first mile, last mile, making sure that you can get to bus stops. All of that is true too. But what we do know is we need more funding to go to operations and being able to actually drive the buses. We also know that with COVID, we're seeing like a shift in workforce. And so we need to find more bus drivers. I think historically, we also know that in the United States, transportation is seen as something that poor people ride. It is not something that is, you know, that is fully accepted. And so we have to do a lot of work in terms of like a media, like a media communication strategy to really say that like mass transit is public transit is accessible, is for everyone. There's ideas that it's not safe. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done around mass transit. I think it's not just funding, but it's also the branding and finding that champion. We have a lot of bills around free transit passes. We had bills around making sure that bus stops had shelters. So there's people working on the margins of transit, but not really full champions. And we need more in the legislature. And I think we need to help, you know, build those people up and find them and help empower them with our advocacy.
Awesome. All righty. Well, I was just going to drop in the chat. I was reminded of an email I just received about a campaign in San Francisco about free Muni, I guess a free Muni full service is what it's called. I just put, if anyone in SF or around is interested, I just put that link in the chat. I think we're very close to 1:30, so we will start to wrap up. Thank you so much, Will and Naila and Linda, for joining and for sharing your expertise and wisdom and thoughts and ideas. We are incredibly grateful and honored to have you all here. We are going to put in a plug because we have been taught that we should always be doing this, even though it's always uncomfortable. We are fundraising in an effort to hire our first staff member at Climate Health Now. I will drop the link in the chat in a second. We have had some early success and would love any more support we can get. So thank you all. Perfect. So a few save the dates, and we'll send all of these links out again. We mentioned already next Wednesday, we'll have our strategy and structure update. We have a link to register for that. Our next monthly meeting will be August 17th, and we will share that registration link as well. And then this came up on this call today, an opportunity for more advocacy around the scoping plan at the California Air Resources Board. And we will share out, again, we have some health specific talking points that were created by Dr. Marjane Moini of SFA PSR that she's very nicely allowed us to share out that are great. And then there's an opportunity in the next 2 weeks to comment in person in Oakland, Fresno, and Los Angeles. So we'll share out those links and then an RSVP form. And I know we didn't have time to go into the details of the scoping plan today, but generally very, very high level, the scoping plan that has been proposed by the Air Resources Board does not protect health and certainly does not protect the communities that have been most highly impacted by fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure. And there's a lot of important advocacy work to be done there. And then we just also wanted to put in a plug for saving the date later in September will be the 3rd annual NorCal Symposium on Climate, Health, and Equity. So
And Amanda and I are going to try to be there on the next Thursday night in Oakland. It's at Laney
College. Yeah.
Laney College. So it'd be cool to see people in all the dimensions. So yeah. And then we also always like to finish with just reminding you that and we'll actually talk about this more at our meeting next Wednesday, but if you have any health professionals, colleagues, or I invited my medical assistant last week to join, health administrators, health students are all welcome to join Climate Health Now. Anybody in California in the health sector, really, writ large. And the way they can join is just go to our website. There's a very prominent join us button, or you can take a picture and send it to them if you want. But we really, it's all about grassroots, inviting friends and colleagues. So please do share that out. And that's it.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Thank you everyone for joining. And Will, Linda, and Naila, thank you again so much for your time.